Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this second session for the Making Use of MOOCs seminar. I'm very pleased once again here on behalf of Emerge Africa to welcome the MOOC implementation team from the University of Cape Town, consisting of Andrew Deacon, Tasneem Jaffer, Janet Small, and Sukaina Walji. In the first session on Tuesday, the team spoke about different types of MOOCs and how they are possibly being reused. And in this session, the team will expand on this discussion of the better usage of MOOCs as well. Let me not speak too much here. I would like to give the word over to Andrew to start this session. Andrew, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Jakob. The seminar, we're focusing on the use or reuse of MOOCs. This is to make a slight distinction from sort of taking MOOCs as a learner, but this is thinking about MOOCs from an educator's perspective and how they can be used to support learning and used in teaching. They're also different from a creator's perspective. It's not how one makes MOOCs, but how one uses MOOCs. And we, on Tuesday, gave quite a few examples of these, and we were particularly interested in talking to other people how they use MOOCs and how these different ways of characterizing these different uses have developed in different institutions across the region. And so on Monday we looked at what are MOOCs, some of the categories in which MOOCs are made, and different distinguishing the way that they're made, who we are in this Emerge seminar, looking at your survey, and then our 6 groups. And today what we're going to do is draw these different feedback that we got from the forum and offer a framework of how to look at these different uses. So just as a recap, what we're looking at is courses that other people have created that are online, so we can use them pretty much everywhere. Online doesn't mean that it's always accessible. It might be in some cases difficult, but there are innovative ways in which people get around this sometimes by downloading videos, etc. And they're open in the sense that no prerequisites for taking the course. They may be free of charge, and they may be open license as well. And these courses are designed for a very large audiences, so they often can be reinterpreted in many different ways, and it's this that we're exploiting in our reuse model. These MOOCs offer opportunities that are different from trying to use materials from traditional courses, and they're different from trying to use materials from existing books and media. It's something in between, so it's both got a strong pedagogical component and it's got lots of digital resources, and it's these opportunities that we're kind of looking at. And so what kind of framework for reuse could we imagine? And this is what we're going to be discussing in the remainder of the session. So we've made the distinction between the creation MOOCs. This has been looked at in quite a lot of detail by other people, and we offer a framework that we found particularly useful of distinguishing between 5 categories, namely showcasing of teaching of a university, a gateway skills, helping students in transition, in other words, graduate literacies, helping students enter a sort of postgraduate study, and professional development, often CPD points and other qualifications for often people who have already graduated but need some additional qualification to prove their ability in a certain area, and then a research case showcase, showcasing what's happening in terms of research at a university. So that's the creation side, and the particular focus we have has been looking at the use, and we've just and the reuse of MOOCs by educators to support their students or support the teaching of their classes. And we've separated this out into two areas. The OER style material reuse and the OEP style whole course or pedagogical reuse. And I'm going to hand over now to Sukaina, who's going to pick up on these types of reuse and describe the MOOC framework in more detail.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So yes, as we go through, we're very interested in whether this framework makes sense, whether there's anything missing. So this is just quite tentative at the moment. We've just developed it over the last few days, so it's having its first outing here. So if you do have any questions, just pop them into the chat. So what we're going to do is we're just going to unpack each of these elements, the three elements, in a little bit more detail to show perhaps some of the why, why you might use, and then some practicalities of what it takes and how. Because some of the just very interesting discussions we had on Monday was around some of the barriers and constraints for use and reuse, and we're also interested in exploring those. So we'll just go through and unpack each of these one by one. So if we look first at the creation model, just because I think this is the one that is almost the default. People create MOOCs and they put them out there. So Andrew also already mentioned that educators' purposes for making MOOCs, or institutions' purposes for making MOOCs, are quite varied. But if we look at the particular kind of pedagogical reasons for why you might make a MOOC, we have outlined our 5 categories. We've written a paper about this. It's on the reading list for this week's seminar. But those are particular reasons for why educators make MOOCs. And the process, so if we move across to the box, the process that's required is that you have to create and build this MOOC from scratch. You have to develop the course, you have to develop the content, and all of the kind of creating and building and implementation tasks. As well as building the MOOC, you have to monitor the MOOC, you make changes, so you're really responsible for the whole course development cycle. And you may want to employ or use mentors and facilitators to assist in the teaching aspects. So that's what it takes in terms of creation. And the enablers, or the sort of pros in a way, are that you have full control over the design, the scheduling and the content, because you are the creator. And you can create to spec if you want to integrate into other teaching or to reuse. So that's one of the kind of enablers or advantages of being able to create MOOCs. Constraints, and we find this very much in our context, is this very resource intensive. There's an onerous sustainability commitment. So how do you sustain these free online courses? Most MOOCs do not make as much money, although some of them are starting to a little bit now. And in terms of timing and the particular academics' availability for development and creation can be a real challenge when they have to balance with other commitments. So creating MOOC, it's not an easy task. Okay, so just an example is that we are in the business of creating MOOCs here, and we have 6 MOOCs currently live and available for people to enroll for the next available date. Okay, so that's we mentioned that, but that's not really our focus in terms of use. So we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the first reuse potential of MOOCs. So this is talking about MOOCs that are out there, whether they are a MOOC that somebody has made in your own institution, or any MOOC that's been put up by another institution and that you can access via one of the platforms such as edX, Coursera, or FutureLearn that we mentioned last time. And the materials reuse model is probably one of the more common or commonly known models. And we've distinguished it in two ways. There's an add-in and an add-on. So an add-in purpose is that you use MOOC or materials in a MOOC as a source to create your own course. So you might gather together materials that are in a particular MOOC and you put them together for your own course. So you can use MOOCs to create a course for your own students. You can use the materials as is, so that means you might download materials and then just include them in your own course, or you might adapt the materials, localize them. And so that's the add-in. And then the add-on, not dissimilar, but rather than using the MOOC materials to create or underpin your course, you might use MOOC materials, standalone materials, to supplement your own current course, either as extra readings. You might add something additional. So it's less, the level of commitment is a little bit less, is one way of seeing it. But and generally you probably use the materials as is. If you are going to adapt and localize, that's a little bit more of a commitment you might be sort of adding in. So that's the kind of materials reuse purpose. And the process that's required, how do you do this, is that you get the materials, you download them usually, and you apply the appropriate licensing conditions, generally Creative Commons licensing. And the MOOCs that we produce here at UCT are mostly, with very few exceptions, Creative Commons license, so the various materials are available for reuse. So constraints of this method of reuse is that, and it's something that's an issue for the OER, the Open Educational Resources movement as a whole, is that often when you take materials and you put them into something else, the pedagogical intentions of the materials are not wrapped in that element. So sometimes it's out of context, and that can be a constraint for your own design. Materials also take time to find, localize, and adapt. So there's a resource issue here. And probably one of the most sort of constraining factors is that not all MOOC materials are Creative Commons licensed for reuse. It doesn't mean you can't use them. You can always request, and you might get permissions from the MOOC conveners, but that is a limitation. Enablers, of course, so if there are Creative Commons licenses used, this does enable reuse. There's an access to huge range of materials in multiple formats, because there are so many MOOCs now available, and most of them are still open enrollment. And also the technical affordances for MOOC platforms do enable downloading. Certainly in the platforms that we work with, FutureLearn and Coursera, our learners are able to download materials. So that's the materials reuse form of using. I'm going to hand over to Janet now, who's going to take us through the next reuse. And just some examples there, which we mentioned earlier about the materials reuse, where on two of our courses, other people have downloaded videos and used them for informal and formal learning.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through one of the other models of making use of MOOCs, which we've been trying to sort of come up with and describe based on our discussions in the last session. And what we're calling this is reuse or adaptation model based on use of the whole course, often or sometimes a particular part. In this case, it's seen, the educator would see value in making use of the entire designed course, or at least a big section of it. And some of the reasons that have been put forward for doing this have been to sort of to enhance the authentic nature of learning. So by having access to a much more diverse audience and classroom than you can often create in your home institution, you're able to give students exposure to a wider audience, and that might be fairly intentional and purposeful for your particular topic. So one of the examples maybe we'll talk about is some of our academics who wanted students to get exposure to multiple perspectives. That can be quite challenging when you've got a small class, say a class of 20 postgraduate students who are all pretty similar, their background and ages, where you get exposure. You might also do it in order to use your space, that's quite sort of precious face-to-face space, for more active learning, so that you would deliver content through a flipped classroom kind of mode, where you would send students away to the MOOC to watch some of the core content, and you would use your classroom space for more active learning engagement. You might also see that if you're offering a course where quite a lot of the students coming in aren't prepared in the same way, or there's a particular gap, maybe you're offering an interdisciplinary course which drawing students from a variety of backgrounds, and you see there's sometimes people are struggling, you could identify a whole course that would offer some introductory level or catch-up skills. So I can think of examples where maybe one of these emerging environmental fields, which has, pulls students from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds that might not share common understanding. So you could use MOOCs to maybe do some bridging of common areas. And then also you can, if you see, good chunks of learning material have been developed through a MOOC, you could use this to provide content and then add on a particular contextualized and relevant assessment activity, or maybe even for credit. So the process of how an academic would do this would be you would basically tell students, this course is running, go and sign up, and you do it in your own time, but you might actually see it as those hours, being counted towards the students' preparatory study, just like you'd say, go and read an academic text, you might say, go and take this course. The other way in which it can be done is by wrapping, where you would actually run like a study group. So you would ask students to enroll in the course, and then you would meet and discuss the material. You would facilitate a discussion around the material. We call that a wrap. And then the other model, which we described also last week, was a partnership, where you actually design a parallel course that has more locally relevant content and very applied, contextually relevant material that runs alongside a more general interest focused MOOC. The enablers of these approaches would be that you can use a whole course for quite an integrated educational purpose, like to support students or for teaching. So it gives you it's really quite a rich form of learning if you use it in its whole form. The MOOC platforms themselves are set up in a way that sort of manages that mass audience. So you don't have to do any of that worrying about who these students are and how to deal with them. Those students that are in the public open course are managed through the platforms. But constraints maybe, which were mentioned in our last chat discussion, I think Yolanda raised, that sometimes the content that's delivered through the MOOC that's designed from another context may not be suitable. And that can be seen as being a problem. It'll take the academic and the lecturer some time to find the courses and to go through them, so you're familiar with what's in them in detail, and you can identify if there are going to be any potential dissonances or problems. And then if you're going to do any kind of adaptation or add-on assessment activities, that obviously will also be quite a bit of time. And then one of the other issues which was raised in the chat the last session was that if the MOOCs are run on a scheduled session-based mode, there can be some difficulty in aligning them with your teaching schedule. But it does depend a little bit on the platform because they are different. And then sometimes by sending students away to work their way through the materials, they may not. They may drop out or lead to non-completion. So those are all limitations to the model. So the examples of where we've seen this being done, and there is quite a lot of this kind of thing going on that we're aware of, and I don't know if you have any to contribute from your experience, is that one of our courses, one of our existing MOOCs has been prescribed by another university. So their students are to take the MOOC, and then they've actually asked the students to write an essay which will be assessed outside of the MOOC environment. Another one of our courses has been recommended as a kind of bridging course for students starting in a research master's program. We've had one of our courses being used in a very sort of a purposeful way as a flipped classroom. So they would send the students to review the lecture material online and then use the discussion spaces to further deepen and enhance the discussion on these particular topics in the course. Our most recent sort of experiment with this is just started, in fact, a week ago, with a new MOOC called Social Innovations, where community groups are running study groups alongside the MOOC as part of their formal process of organizing the youth into study material and then hopefully some project outcomes. At UCT, it's actually used fairly mainstreamly by the postgraduate office, which offers a series of facilitated MOOCs as part of the skills development and professional development for postgraduate students. And then the example which we also referred to last week was where UCT law faculty is offering a like parallel course on copyright around the particularities of laws in this country, but it runs side an Harvard X course on copyright law in general, which has been also a very successful model. So that's sort of like a summary from our side of how we see the possible uses and reuses. I haven't been keeping a close eye on the chat, so I'm not sure if anybody's been raising other ways in which you're familiar with uses. I know somebody was mentioning here that you could see being purposefully reusing MOOCs in order to kind of study their design online courses. I don't know, that could be a whole category of reuse, but we could just see if you think that's one. But these are the elements that we've identified so far. And I don't know whether if anybody wants to put forward a challenge to those or an add on to any of those, or if you think that if we haven't sort of captured the key enablers and constraints for any of these modes. I think somebody in the chat, Adejara, is talking about reuse of content into creating a new course, and I think I was saying that could possibly be seen as being an add-in, but I don't know. Maybe we could see what the responses are coming up in the chat, or I could ask one of the other facilitators to comment. The response to your question, Nicola, it's actually a local installation of edX, so it's run through Harvard itself, offering a MOOC called. So it's like a very defined MOOC. It's not part of the big edX platform, but it's using the Open edX software. But it's offered as Copyright X through Harvard, and it's an affiliate model. So it's like a formal agreement between UCT Law and Harvard on that course. But it's done as two courses. So there's a UCT course on copyright law that runs parallel to the Harvard course on copyright law. So it's quite a formal model. It's not the norm. It's an unusual model, although an interesting one. The partnership model, in terms of there's no money exchange around that unless you charge for it. At the moment, these are all free courses. And so as soon as an institution is going to try and sell some membership to it, then you'd have to negotiate payments between the partners. That's that particular model. I'm sure there are others out there in the world that we're not necessarily aware of. Does anybody else want to? Sukaina or Andrew, you want to raise any of the issues?
Just looking through the chat. So Jakob asked about, have the platforms you have been using been fine with Creative Commons licensing? And I did reply on there, but just to expand to say, generally, yes, we haven't had an issue. There does seem to be some, beliefs and conversations in the MOOC community that somehow these platforms lock down copyright. But in our experience, we've just specified that in the contract, and we've just had that agreement formally in the contract that we can release under Creative Commons licensing, and so that hasn't been an issue. We generally agree with the educator of the course what license they would like. We try and recommend the most open, but we do negotiate with them if they've got any particular concerns, and that we might put a slightly more restrictive license on.
So in terms of your point there, Jari, then it depends. If the licensing precludes sale, then you'd have to be cautious with repackaging materials. If the Creative Commons license is a non-commercial one, then you probably couldn't repackage that and then sell a course, because that would be against the compliance of the copyright law. But some of them are even more open than that. Somebody else here, Nicola, you were responding to my question to you about whether we could imagine another category, which is using MOOCs for kind of imagining or learning design as online. And you're saying you've really used them more to look at assessment tools and particularly things like peer review and portfolio. So I guess that's part of it. It's saying you'd use a MOOC very very sort of purposefully to identify different methods, say, of assessment online, but that would be more for like a study, it'd form like a little informal study process.
That's more like you would do it for yourself, I imagine. Whereas our focus here has been
on other users,
on how an educator might see how a particular MOOC could be used. So
to help students learning, to help.
So if I were teaching, but to be fair, if I were teaching a module on educational technology, I might suggest to my students, go and look at this MOOC to see how other people do learning design. But that would be the prescribed model. Right?
Would it be prescribed model? But we were imagining prescribed model. Let's go back to the whole MOOC, or were we saying?
We said part. It can be part.
Okay, because I remember I just wanted to give an example, which is not exactly relevant, but it would be the same. Where when I was enrolled, in fact, in a MOOC, which was offered by the Open University, and they were doing a session on open education resources, and their task to the learners was to go and review a given number of OER platforms or repositories in order to evaluate them. So the task was to go and review the platform, the repositories' approaches to OER. So as a making use of MOOCs as an educator, you could say, and you say you were teaching learning design, you could prescribe that students had to visit, say, X number of courses and evaluate the strategies being used. That probably would fall into our category of
whole part reuse for a pedagogical strategy. So your pedagogical strategy is to open students to authentic learning, because it's learning design that's already been done, and you might ask them to critically reflect on them. So you actually design an activity where you use some or part of a MOOC for a pedagogical purpose that supports your own course.
Yeah, so would that make sense, to, Nicola, from what you're describing? That would be a way of seeing that as a reuse.
And you could do it as a prescribed for self-study, or you could wrap it. You might have a study group set up that you discuss it together, like we used to run study groups to look at MOOCs ourselves when we were learning about them.
So I see that Tasneem and Nicola are discussing the issue of use and abuses of MOOC materials, and I think what Tasneem is saying, that the setup of the MOOC platforms almost always allows download of materials, whatever the licensing terms, because sometimes if people have a problem with bandwidth, so on, they might download for personal viewing. But that you're saying that it feels then it's like an OER, whether or not the licensing allows legal sharing. I suppose that's true, yes.
Well, I think that's probably the case for many materials on the internet, because really anything that's online is by default copyright unless it has a Creative Commons license on it. And we know from quite a bit of research that people are using, you might want to use the word misusing, but that's a matter of interpretation. Freely using,
whatever,
yes.
Without compliance with the law.
And some of the other discussions we're picking up on are not necessarily using the content, but using the form of the assessment or the style of the assessment or the style of the presentation. So that's even a more grey area about how people, particularly educators, are signing up to MOOCs to get ideas for how they might take their teaching online. And this fits on the edge of our categories, but it is.
Could be another. We could develop another one, which is more like, but a more very purposeful professional development. But it wouldn't still be. It would still be self-use.
Yes.
Self-use with weird distinction between how might you, as an educator or a learning designer, use the MOOCs that are out there. I'm just looking at, just to pick up on Tasneem's comments about being able to download, and Tasneem, you're saying, I think the downloadability from the platform gives it an extra, it's okay for me to use it feel. Yes, I think it does. I think it's probably worth noting, I think that the Coursera platform, and I'm not sure about FutureLearn, do have something in their terms and conditions saying that you can download for your personal use. But I'm not sure that, but unless they're licensed legally, you can't. Adijara, I'm just looking at your question. Are education materials not exempted from the copyright laws? Not in the case of MOOCs.
It's a complicated.
Oh, yeah.
It's a complicated thing. Yes, in the United States, they have laws that allow educators to have fair use in educational contexts. Different countries have different laws, and for example, South Africa's law is much more restrictive, and this is a little bit of a grey area because nobody can see you actually using it in your classroom, and things like OER were trying to open educational resources and Creative Commons licensing were initiatives to try and clarify that use. But it would tend to be different in different countries.
But I just think from just giving the creation perspective, for example, when we are creating MOOCs, we can't put in any educational material that we would like to, even though we could argue that the MOOC is an educational endeavour, unless we have cleared the copyright and the permissions. So it's difficult for us to justify fair use when we design MOOCs.
And I think it's largely to do with the kind of, Andrew's point, to do with the scale and the sort of openness of it, because even though, as Andrew said, the definitions on use for educational purposes are different in different countries, which makes it kind of hard for people like us trying to figure it out. But in the case of the MOOCs, because they're an open classroom, if you like, an open global classroom, then some of those fair use doctrines around educational use for educational purposes don't really apply, and so you have to be very cautious about getting clearing the rights for use in that kind of space.
Okay.
Have there been any opposition to? I mean, I'm not sure from any side. So the community. Well, so far, as Sukaina said, when creating a MOOC and deciding, in our case, on how to license the material, it's a discussion we have with the academic creators, what they envisage. But certainly from the UCT project side, this has been. The impulse for making MOOCs has been to share knowledge and material. So that's kind of an easy answer for us, because the whole purpose of the project is to make material more accessible and shareable. So that has been, easy to resolve around that. And and the platforms, as Sukaina explained, we're pre-negotiated that. I think where it can become conflictual is if there's any issues around charging entry fees and selling the course, then there might be some conflict over sharing, openness and sharing. But if you're an educator wanting to reuse, you just need to pay attention to what the license terms are on the material that you're looking at. And they do differ, so you can't assume that every MOOC has material that is freely shareable. They should actually specify.
That's only if you want to actually download it and use it. But if you just want to ask your students to prescribe them to go and take 4 weeks of a particular MOOC, and then you will set an essay for them, there's no restriction on you doing that. The MOOCs, by their very nature, are open enrollment. So and in terms of when Jakob, you asked about any concerns from the community or the MOOC platforms. I think just from the point of view of our educators, they've been very pleased when people have reused their things, or at least been quite happy to, say, well, that's fine, because I think it's also acknowledgement of their work, and if you are going to make a MOOC, you've probably got a bit of a propensity for openness, and wanting to share and get your work out there. So if people do take it on, there's a good chance that there will be a positive reaction.
There have been a few horror stories where there have been disagreements between the educators, the platforms, and some other users around reuse. But there have only been a very few documented examples of where people have got very, very upset, where somebody's used it or abused the reuse. And yes, situations like that can happen, but as Sukaina said, the vast majority of the cases, that there is the aim is in fact to encourage the reuse. Typically, where the problems come in is where there are incredibly successful materials, particularly for particularly commercially very successful courses, and there's some contestation about does the university own the materials, does the educator own the materials, and in some quite extreme cases, people have tried to take materials from a MOOC and offer them on some other platform for a fee. These are very sort of rare examples where somebody's tried to abuse the system, but overall it's been working much more successfully than I think most of us ever imagined a few years ago.
Okay, I think I'm just seeing if we've got any other questions. But if not, maybe we can hand over back to you, Jakob, if you want to pick up on anything. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you very much, Sukaina, Andrew, and Janet and Tasneem. This is certainly a very interesting discussion. I would just like to check. We still have a few more minutes left. I would like to check with Nicola if there are any issues that you think should be that you would like to highlight. Yes, indeed, thought-provoking. And I'm wondering if... Sorry, Nicola, please go ahead.
No, I was expecting that. I was just wondering with the sort of my last comment was actually that it's a big issue, this thing around who owns the material, and I think the reuse and the ability to reuse perhaps depends on this perception, because in a lot of African university contexts, regulation is a big thing, and the university owns materials rather than the individual. I was wondering if the MOOC team has any examples from other African contexts on reuse. Thanks.
So Yeah, absolutely. The policy environment and the whatever the IP rules of the institution do affect what academics can share. Now, in terms of our MOOCs, as we've said, we have been able to license them Creative Commons. Not many other universities in Africa are making MOOCs. Of the ones that are, so I know the African Virtual University have made a number of MOOCs, and they have licensed their materials also as openly licensed under Creative Commons. It may also be that even though an institution might have a particular IP policy, the MOOC project sometimes sits outside of the formal teaching and learning materials production. So it may be that some institutions might be able to have different licensing. We just don't know yet, because we don't have many examples of African MOOCs apart from ours. We do know that in South Africa only 5 institutions give the IP to the academics to be able to share their materials. So that's quite potentially limiting, as you mentioned, but we don't have much data yet on how that's impacting MOOCs outside of the few that we already know about. Okay, back to you, Jakob.
Thank you, Sukaina, for elaborating on that point. I'm just wondering if I see Laura is gone now. I'm wondering if just before we close, if Abi, who joined a bit later in the session, has any comments or thoughts that you perhaps would like to share. And Mohammed as well. As mentioned earlier, this session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available a bit later on our landing page for the seminar and through our Facebook group and Twitter as well. While I see Aditya is typing now, in the meantime, I would just like to give some attention to our seminar landing page. I'm just pasting the URL in the text chat now. This also serves as a resource page where resources from the seminar during the week will be available, and the recording of the 2 seminars along with the slides as well. And let me also encourage to check the reading list that has been compiled by the MOOC implementation team. And I see Aditya has a question for Sukaina about the involvement of the African Union in creating African MOOCs. So I don't know, Sukaina, if you would like to just reply to that.
I'm not aware of any initiatives from the AU for either an African MOOC, Pan-African MOOC platform, or any policy around that. And various institutions are developing MOOCs. So now the National Open University of Nigeria is probably the most ambitious in terms of intention, at least. They have committed to producing or reworking all of their teaching materials as open educational resources in the near future, and also to produce a series of MOOCs that are openly licensed. So various institutions seem to be looking at this space and seeing how useful it can be, but I don't know of any initiatives for something that is like an African MOOC platform. I don't know if anybody else does.
Let's talk about the African Virtual University, perhaps that's what you meant.
You said African Union, but the African Virtual University has, I think, 3 MOOCs, the AVU, and they also have a quite an extensive network, but I'm not sure how their MOOC initiative is, what their plans are beyond the 3 that they've got at the moment. Yeah, Tony says, if so, referring to the possibility of the African Union, it will be the kind of initiative that takes a long time to get going from an AU level. Tony seems to be speaking from resigned experience there, that these initiatives, yeah, definitely easier to get moving by individual institutions.
Thank you, Sukaina. We are getting close to top of the hour to scheduled end time for this session. Welcome to you, Natalie. We are close to wrapping up this session, but like I said before, the recording of this will be available. And let me also say that the discussion forum will remain open. If you go to the landing page for the seminar, you will get access to the forum. And please come and discuss these issues. The team has put up a slide now, which serves to also highlight some issues that could be very interesting to discuss further asynchronously. And I also see another participant joining us, Jan. Thank you, Jan, for joining us. We are close to wrapping up, but resources will remain available also beyond this week. Looking at the clock now, and it's just gotten to noon here in South Africa. And by that, we will be closing this session. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope for a bit of interaction in our discussion forum throughout the day. Right, what I'm going to do now is to switch off the recording.